Hello, world geographers. This is Dr. Devine here. Welcome to the lecture on us versus them. I'm going to go ahead and jump into it, but before I do, let me remind you that your last reading quiz is on Monday and is going to be based on a chapter. Oops, sorry, folks. I'm getting that fixed tomorrow. Is based on this book, The Price of Inequality by Nobel Prize winner in economics, Joseph Stiglitz. So today we're focusing on sort of what's wrong and how the current moment and the current frustrations over neoliberalism has produced an us versus them dynamic and backlash against globalization, backlash against people from other countries, xenophobia. And on Monday, we are going to be looking at some ideas about what we can do about it. And on that note, just keep in mind that you want to be reading that chapter. It's going to be the last reading that's assigned for this class. I had originally planned to do a session on COVID as a chapter of globalization. But I think we're all just too exhausted and too worried at this moment to be thinking about COVID from an academic standpoint. And I don't want to run the risk of making this moment more difficult for you by asking you to study it and think about it. I realize it might be impacting you in really tremendous ways that I don't fully appreciate. So look for that quiz on Monday. I will send a reminder email when it's made available. Let's go ahead and jump into the lecture for today. Just a second here. I'm having a little bit of trouble bringing up my PowerPoint. Here we go. I think now I should be able to do this. There we go. Okay, so here's the lecture. I just posted these slides to our Tracks site. I'm a little bit behind today. Thanks for your understanding. The topic of today's lecture is global inequality, us versus them. And the chapter that you read and that I read was titled, was the introduction in the first chapter from this book, Winners and Losers, right? And let's review some key ideas. One of the main arguments that we have been looking at in this week, is that the period of neoliberal globalization, what many people call globalism, the faith and belief in neoliberal economics and policies, that neoliberalism at the global level has deepened income inequality and has produced a sharp divide between so-called winners and losers of neoliberalism. And there have been far more many losers than winners, as growing inequality would suggest. A few people have done spectacularly well under the conditions of free trade, under the conditions of reduced taxation, reduced welfare, reduced taxation as a mechanism of redistributing wealth in this country and around the world, okay? So a lot of people are feeling quite angry about this inequality, even if they don't have the macroeconomic tools to give it a name. So let's dig back in here. I want to just remind you that we are looking at neoliberalism as the resurgence of economic ideas of free trade, comparative advantage, and global political and economic integration that occurred alongside technological advancements in telecommunication. And we're talking about the time period of roughly the late 1970s, the 1970s, to arguably 2008. And there is a lot of debate among political economists trying to understand if this moment of anti-globalism that we're experiencing now is marking sort of the end to the neoliberal era. And we've made the argument in our class that these huge transitions between one dominant economic ideology to another, that these huge moments of economic change often occur alongside crises. And we certainly saw how the Great Depression and World War II brought an end to the era of colonial liberalism, ushering in Keynesian economics, which did not have blind faith in free markets and comparative trade, but identified states as playing a large role in managing the market, protecting people from the markets, redistributing the wealth generated by capitalist economies. And then following another economic crisis in the 1970s, we see a shift away from Keynesian state-led New Deal economics to what we understand to be neoliberalism, the resurgence of the liberalism that defined the global economy prior to the Great Depression and World War II. So here we're in this moment. Certainly the Great Recession of 2007 to 2010, which was the another major, sort of the third major economic crisis we're looking on this timeline. It plays a big part in explaining the backlash against neoliberal globalization, what Brenner calls globalism, and what many people in popular circles call globalism as well. Just by way of review, to give you some data from the World Economic Report we looked at, you can see this rising inequality in terms of the distribution of wealth in the United States. So here we have, this is a graph just of the United States. You're looking at the share of wealth that's held by 1% of the US population versus the share that's owned by the bottom half, about 115 million people versus the 1% of the population, 3 million. We have a population of about 330 million people in the United States. So what you see here is that around 1996, the wealth of that 1% surpassed the wealth of the bottom half. That's what we mean by global inequality manifesting in the United States. And the United States isn't actually an extreme case. The United States has had much more growth and inequality than other places in Western Europe, but is not nearly as unequal as the Middle East as a region. So this is a trend that has changed dramatically. You can see in 1980, kind of right around our timeline for the beginning of neoliberal reforms and neoliberal economic policies in the United States, that the 1% had about 11% of the national wealth. Today, that's over 20%. I would argue the number has gone up once again following President Trump's tax reforms, most certainly. And that number has declined. The share of the bottom half of the economy. The bottom 50% of wage earners in the US used to have 21% of the national wealth. Now they have 13%. So most of us probably are in this bottom one half. I know I certainly am. And this has made, this translates into people having less economic security, having to take on more debt to pay for their kids' education, not being able to purchase a home. This translates into health problems and lack of health care for people who can't afford to buy it or do not have a job that provides that health care. So here's another way of looking at it. Here's the disconnect. This comes from the Economic Policy Institute. What you're looking at here in this graph is another look at US inequality. And what's really striking is that inequality is rising because US productivity has increased, but hourly compensation has not. So the economy is making more money, but the average worker is not making more money. So that difference between what workers are being paid and the wealth that's being generated is going into the pockets of not just the 1%, but the 0.001%. So this quote comes from Bremer's book. He states that the Independent National Bureau of Economic Research found that incomes for the bottom half of earners in the US was flat between 1980 and 2014, while income for the top 0.001% surged 636%. So we're going to be talking about these superstar salaries and CEOs that are part of this 0.001%. And it looks like since 1973, right, we see this big break. That year should not be surprising to you, that productivity has increased 72%, but hourly compensation a mere 9%, okay? During the era of the New Deal and economic nationalism in the United States and Keynesian economics, productivity matched the rise in wages. So the average American felt the benefit of economic growth in our country, where today that is not the same. And a lot of people feel frustrated about this. We're going to be talking about populism today, not just the populism of right nationalist governments like those that are emerging out of Europe and even here in the United States with the election of President Trump in 2016, but also the populism of Bernie Sanders, part of the us versus them that comes out of this inequality and this frustration with this inequality is that most Americans feel like the very rich, that 0.001%, is not getting rich because they deserve to make those vast quantities of money. It's coming at the expense of corporate bailouts and corporate socialism, right? For all of the critiques of socialism that we have in our society, we need to remember that, you know, socialism is also when the government spends our taxpayers' dollars to subsidize these super rich companies, or to bail them out, as the big banks were bailed out by the Obama administration following the 2008 crisis, despite the fact that it was the wheeling and dealing and risk-taking of those banks that made them fabulously wealthy and then got us into this recession problem that we had in 2008. So a lot of people are feeling angry, not just about the growing inequality, but the fact that the US government uses taxpayers' dollars to continually subsidize these companies, bail them out, while many Americans struggle to have health insurance, let alone be able to save money for the astoundingly expensive and increasing costs of higher education. So this is a study from MSNBC. Maybe you've heard this before, but you know, Walmart, which is one of the wealthiest companies in the world, their employees receive nearly $7.8 billion a year. That company is subsidized by the government, $7.8 billion a year in tax breaks. And also that also includes the amount of welfare that is paid to Walmart employees, food stamps, Medicaid, all of those welfare programs that are supposed to help people who are out of work actually are now being put to the service to keeping the wages super low in uber wealthy companies like Walmart. And I've seen some stuff on social media that also talks about, you know, how much money Jeff Bezos has made during the COVID pandemic, but yet he still claims that the company doesn't have enough money to provide all of its workers health insurance, something like $30 billion. So anyway, this is the 0.001% that people are feeling frustrated with. And I want to take you to that article. There was an interesting graph here, and I think I have to share a different screen. So just bear with me here for a minute. Okay, so this is the article in Axios, which is from 2008, and it looks at the compensation for healthcare CEOs. One of the arguments is that healthcare is too expensive to nationalize, to provide everybody access to healthcare. But what we see is that the privatization of healthcare in the United States generates superstar salaries. And you can actually go and not just look at healthcare, finance, all companies. So these are the pay, the actual annual pay of CEOs for Fortune 500 companies, and in terms of their actual pay, what they get in salaries, but also in stocks and other sort of ways of transferring wealth. And what we see here, I mean, check out this guy. He made $148 million in 1 year. Cigna, Laboratory Corporation of America, 32 million. This is I used to be insured by this insurance group, Aetna, $60 million in 1 year. That is how you get to a distribution of wealth in our country that looks something like this, okay? And of course, through neoliberalism, through the scaling back of the state taxing these superstar salaries and the aims of redistributing some of that income, maybe taxing that $60 million a year and 50%, so then the poor CEO only gets 30 million a year, right? And the other, that has been reduced to a bare minimum. So that now me as a teacher who earns way under 6 figures a year, I pay the same tax bracket as somebody who makes 60 million a year, okay? So that's part of the problem, that's part of the frustration that's going to lead up to this backlash against neoliberalism and the economic order that's defined the world since 1970s. So let's dig a little bit more into the rising gap between the rich and the poor in the United States. I have a CNBC video clip for you to watch. I'm going to watch it with you. The video is going to work us through some various dynamics that are contributing to this inequality gap. First, the video is going to talk about automation and the fact that a lot of the loss of working class jobs, of good working class jobs, has come not from the relocation of manufacturing to the global south under conditions of free trade and foreign direct investment, but also through automation. Neoliberal globalization, we're going to be looking at that as a factor in the video. 3, rise of superstar salaries, both companies and CEOs. I just showed you an example of the vast wealth that a handful of people own in our society. The video is also going to mention that one of the contributions to stagnant wages has been the hollowing out of the labor movement in the United States. A lot of that has to do with the fact that many unionized jobs were in manufacturing, but unions advocate for higher wages and better working conditions through collective bargaining power. So in the absence of unions, we've had not only abroad, but in the US, a race to the bottom with wages. At the same time that healthcare benefits, maternal, paternal benefits do not meet the needs of our workers. And then finally, in this system of inequality, of a handful of people being uber rich, actually the system of inequality is undermining American meritocracy. Because when you have such vast inequality in American society, that trickles down to the public school systems. We know how unequal the public school system here is in the United States. And it creates a situation in which the uber rich, with whether their kids be mediocre in terms of their talent and their intellect, are getting into our nation's best colleges by buying their way in. While presumably students who are more talented and more naturally gifted are falling through the cracks, and we as a society are losing out on some of that talent. Okay, so let's go ahead and watch this video to dig into a little bit more of what's happening with inequality in America. I'm going to watch it with you. I need to share my screen, so just give me a second here. Okay. All right.
For 40 years, the U.S.-led global economy has produced an enormous improvement in human welfare. Since 1981, the proportion of the world's population living in extreme poverty on less than $1.90 per day has fallen from 42% to 10%. But in countries with advanced economies, inequality of income and wealth has surged. And nowhere has it surged more than in the U.S., where reliance on free market forces has been strongest. That magnifies rewards for those at the top and leaves most others behind. The trend helps those with higher levels of education and hurts the less educated. It lifts residents of major cities while leaving those in small towns behind. For growing numbers of Americans, it's just harder to get ahead. Why has this happened, and what are the consequences? Here are 5 causes. The digital revolution creates enormous wealth for those with the skills and preparation to take advantage, but it eliminates what economists call middle skill jobs. Computer software and industrial machines now fill roles from clerical tasks to routine manufacturing that once produced middle-class incomes for workers without college degrees.
One of those forces is technological progress that has increased the value of abstract problem-solving, interpersonal communication, organizational skills, things that highly educated workers tend to be very capable of. It has simultaneously devalued a lot of cognitively intensive but repetitive tasks in offices and production lines, and so kind of hollowed out the set of job activities available to non-college workers and sort of pushed them arguably downward into personal services, food services, cleaning, security, transportation, repair, where their skills are more interchangeable with other workers and where there's less of a return to experience over the life cycle. And so that has contributed to downward pressure and wage pressure and economic insecurity for the less educated. So it's really kind of created a great world for the highly educated and a much less economically secure and inviting world for people who don't have high levels of education.
Competition from emerging economies like China's, combined with reduced trade barriers, have further reduced prospects for workers without advanced skills. That's had devastating consequences in sectors such as textiles and furniture and leather goods.
The biggest economic story of the century, and certainly of the last 50 years, has been China's rise. China going from a poor and backward country in perpetual political and economic crisis to a frontier manufacturer with pretty well-educated, highly available, skilled labor using modern technology. So China marched up the productivity technology frontier between 1980 and the present at a rate almost unseen in history. And because it was so vast, because it had so many people, so many resources, so much land, it could become a manufacturer for now at this point more than 20% of all world manufacturing value added. And that's not a function of trade deals. That's primarily a function of internal developments in China, the decision to allow free mobility of labor, to adopt Western technology and foreign direct investment, and to start trading with the world. And that had a big effect on the United States, even in the 90s. But when China joined in 2001, that further opened the floodgates, and that had a dramatic accelerant effect on the rate at which competition entered the U.S. Market for manufactured goods and the rate of decline of U.S. manufacturing employment as a result of that. Over the course of just 7 years, about 20% of all U.S. manufacturing jobs disappeared. And then it fell by another cumulative 11 percentage points during the Great Recession. So effectively 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs no longer existed that had existed around 2000.
Breakthrough firms such as Apple and Amazon now attract revenue across the world, which produces immense jackpots for the executives who lead them and for the American cities they call home.
If you create the innovation and you have the global product market, you're going to have much larger earnings than in a previous generation. There is increasingly divergence in economic growth and economic outcomes across places in the US. And so there are just, along with these superstar workers and these superstar firms, we now have superstar cities in our increasingly winner-take-all economy.
Meanwhile, the share of workers represented by labor unions has dropped by half, shrinking their power. The lowest paid workers have seen the buying power of the minimum wage drop, as the government has not increased it to keep pace with inflation.
Fewer than 70% of men with a high school degree or less are working. The eroded value of the minimum wage in many cases, the decline in unionization, things that have otherwise sort of hurt workers' bargaining power in ways that amplified their weakened bargaining power just coming from these external forces where they were already, competing with technology or workers from lower wage countries, for example.
The shifting power balance has rewarded the wealthiest even more through policies in government and private institutions, from tax changes that increase their income to college admissions procedures that open doors for their children above others.
Actresses Felicity Huffman and Lori Loughlin are headed from the red carpet to federal court.
13 parents and one coach who have pleaded guilty.
The market incentives inequality creates for hard work and risk-taking helps make America's economy dynamic, but it also imposes costs.
You need some inequality. The problem is when that dynamism at a point in time gives rise to dynasticism, such that the next generation doesn't get an equal footing, such that kids of affluent parents, even if they're are mediocre talent, get to go to the best schools and get access to the most after-school investment, the most training, and so on. And talented kids from less affluent families don't get to go to good schools. They don't get invested in the same way. And that's a loss for all of us. That's not just a loss for them. That means our society will be less productive.
And it fuels the nonstop turmoil in American politics. Voters have thrown out the party in control of the White House or one chamber of Congress in 6 of the past 7 national elections. 2020 promises to be just as contentious.
I think we're seeing that loud and clearly in the sort of politics of the past few years. People are increasingly likely to report that they believe the system is rigged against them. This is damaging both for the functioning of our democracy, but I actually think also for the functioning of our economy. We're going to see people in increasing numbers sort of dropping out of our mainstream climb to economic success. And so we've got this economic malaise, and now we have this social malaise going along with it, and it's leading to political, large, loud political cries for completely, I think, upending our capitalist system.
Okay. Let me just go ahead and pause that video. All right. So if you had trouble hearing that, of course, you are welcome to follow the link here. So those are 5 explanations for the growing inequality gap between rich and poor in the United States. And number 2, I think, could be a little bit more narrowly defined as the globalization of companies allowing for these rise of certain CEOs and brands like Apple or Amazon capturing larger shares, not only of a national economy, but of a global economy. All right. So let's get back to the lecture here. So what we're looking at and what we really spent time looking at from a macroeconomic perspective last class was that neoliberalism's impact on inequality has not just impacted the United States, although the United States has been an extreme example of growing inequality in the developed world. We've seen a lot of growing inequality in places like China and India with the growth of a middle class there, which those benefits also haven't been distributed equally. And then, of course, with Russia's with Russia entering into the capitalist global economy, actually there's been an emergence of sort of this oil kleptocracy, sort of this oligarchy that has access to Russia's oil revenues. And while Russia has entered into capitalist markets and liberalized their markets, in many ways it still functions to benefit the few. And the few are reminiscent and a legacy of the old communist era. Okay. So what this has bred, and what you all certainly have been living through, is that this growing inequality has created a lot of backlash. And as people have identified their frustration with the status of the global economy, their own personal experiences, we have witnessed around the world since 2008, with the global economic recession, the housing crisis, the rise of nationalism, and that has been seen as a solution to this rising nationalism. That nationalism is seen as a solution for anti-globalism, or the response to all of these changes. Okay. Now this sort of movement, this nationalist movement, is also being described as anti-globalism, or the new nationalism. And this is being led by not just the United States, but also leaders of the French National Front Party, and also in the UK Independence Party. And certainly this is going to culminate with the vote for Brexit in the UK, and the election of many populist, nationalist, right-leaning leaders around the world. And in our country, President Trump has certainly made this argument loud and clear. So let's go ahead and hear his own words. I have shown you this clip in the past, but it's worth bringing it back right now. So this is, President Trump during the election season prior to his election in 2016, talking about globalism.
No country has ever prospered that failed to put its own interests first. Both our friends and our enemies put their countries above ours. And we, while being fair to them, must start doing the same. We will no longer surrender this country or its people to the false song of globalism. The nation state remains the true foundation for happiness and harmony. I am skeptical of international unions that tie us up and bring America down, and will never enter. And under my administration, we will never enter America into any agreement that reduces our ability to control our own affairs.
Okay, so let's go ahead and close that out. Okay, so yes, this song of anti-globalism has certainly been impacting American politics, but I want you to understand that this is not just a response to neoliberalism or neoliberal globalism that has motivated President Trump supporters, because also this populism, this anger towards who's winning, who's losing, the rules of the game being rigged in the service of the few. This is certainly fueling the populism of Bernie Sanders, right? It's simply that Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump are sort of harnessing and explaining this frustration and this anger in different ways. Okay, so while President Trump tends to blame free trade agreements and also immigrants and immigration for many of the country's economic problems, Bernie Sanders tends to blame Wall Street and to blame the 1%, the uber rich, those top salary CEOs. Okay, so this populism is both this anger towards neoliberalism, the anger and frustration with the global economy that most working and middle class people have experienced in this country is fueling both the populism of Donald Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders. And most certainly, we understand that the Brexit vote in 2016 is also a product of this moment. So we talked about this early on in the class, talking about the making and remaking of Europe and what a complex concept Europe is as a geography. Seems to be that there's many more differences than similarities bringing that area together. And today that statement is probably more true than ever, as sort of the ties that bound Europe together through the European Union are being unraveled. And we'll get into a little bit more what's happening in Europe to drive that. But I want to sort of bring some of these right-leaning nationalist populist in Europe to life, to give you a sense of this is not just something that's happening in the United States, that this sort of reaction to globalism and a resurgence of nationalism is occurring around the world. Yeah, there's a lot more going on than just the economy, but we'll come back to those dynamics after looking at this clip.
European politicians. They speak different languages, but they're all singing the same tune.
L'Union européenne, c'est une véritable épouvante.
Mai rendetlen Európa képtelen megoldásokat találni ezekre a kihívásokra.
Noi andiamo in Europa per ribaltarla questa Europa.
And that's weird, because one belief that unites these nationalist, populist European leaders is that the European Union should be less united. Since the Euro crisis of 2009 and the migrant crisis of 2015, these right-wing populist movements have grown in strength and in number.
Európa már most invázió alatt áll. 10 és 10 milliók indulnak meg Európába, Afrikából és a Közel-Keletről.
His campaign against Muslim refugees won his party 2/3 of the seats in Hungary's general election in 2018. Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party doesn't sound all that different.
Co się dzieje we Francji? Nieustanna awantura, też wprowadzany szariat.
Law and Justice won an outright majority in 2015. Every European country has its own version. Tomio Okamura is a Czech nationalist politician born in Japan who wants a zero-tolerance policy on immigration.
Nemůžeme si dovolit zaplavit naše země migranty z nepřátelských a nekompatibilních kultur.
It's not clear what this means, but it plays into European fears of what they call an invasion. In other words, immigration.
I would stop immigration of non-Western immigrants immediately.
They all accuse Brussels of behaving like a dictatorship.
Jsme pod totálním diktátem Bruselu a v podstatě jsme ztratili jakoukoliv samostatnost. Těch je celá řada.
Which is ironic, given that they're all running in democratic elections for the EU Parliament. They often speak of a supposed plot by mainstream leaders like Angela Merkel to replace Europeans with lower-paid migrants.
Sono convinto che l'immigrazione sia un progetto studiato e finanziato per sostituire etnicamente i popoli europei con nuovi schiavi da pagare a 3 euro all'ora per il loro lavoro.
And they tend not to like feminism or gay rights. They may say some provocative or even hateful things, but their language and ideas are consistent all across Europe, and they are clearly effective. Pollsters predict that these Eurosceptic parties will see a significant rise in votes in the European election. Ironically, It's the Eurosceptic parties that seem to be doing the best job building pan-European politics. The question is whether the parties that believe in a stronger Europe can do the same thing.
Okay. So we just saw that in Italy, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, there are now popular nationalist movements, and indeed in Germany, a white nationalist party came in second in presidential or in the elections there. Sorry, I have a security issue coming up on my computer. And so what we see is that, you know, nobody would have ever thought that in Germany, following the rise of Hitler's Nazi party, that any sort of nationalist party based on ethnicity or race would ever gain popularity. But it is. And this is going to have to do with not only economic crisis caused by the architects of neoliberal globalization, the powerful banks, and their wheeling and dealing, slicing and dicing of mortgages and hedge funds, and that got us into that mess of 2008. And then they got a golden handshake and a bailout while millions of Americans lost their savings, all of their savings in their homes. And this comes after 30 decades of stagnating wages and increasing healthcare costs and increasing education. And all of those economic problems then confront another dynamic of globalism, which is sort of the increasing flows of people and migrant flows, refugee flows. So let's come back to that conversation, and that's what's going to lead us back to our text that we read for today. Here we are, folks. Okay. So when Bremer is sort of working us through the failures of globalism, and in a minute I'm going to be really precise in saying he's not talking about globalization more broadly. We talk about globalization, the transatlantic slave trade, as the history of colonialism. You could even argue that the immigration of Homo sapiens from Africa 100,000 years ago is part of globalization, but we're talking about a very specific, narrow, limited amount of time. Really the transformation of the global economy that started in the 1970s, right, that has got us into this economic mess and this economic inequality. And there were large-scale protests that date farther back, but the text says that, you know, the WTO, the World Trade Organization protest in Seattle, which turned violent, should have been a clear sign that even in the countries that were selling neoliberal globalism around the world, that there was already backlash and anger among the working class and the middle classes. In 2008, we had the high housing crisis and the global recession. This spurs a European economic crisis, a debt crisis, and basically, you know, coming out of Greece in particular, many Eastern European states that didn't have as strong as economy, they got really wrapped up in this debt crisis. And many countries from within Western Europe felt angry about sending money to Eastern Europe to help with Eastern European countries. And of course, that anger and frustration can only be understood within the economic context that preceded that crisis, right? People feel angry about that transfer of wealth because they themselves feel like they're suffering. There's not enough for people within England. So why is England sending money to Athens or to Greece, right? And then, you know, we had the Occupy Wall Street movement in the United States. And then really importantly and horrifically, the Syrian refugee crisis. We learned about the Syrian war, which starts in 2013, some 6 million Syrian refugees, many of them trying to get to Europe, many of them primarily going to Lebanon, to Jordan, and to Turkey. A small percentage of those Syrian refugees were arriving in Germany, arriving in Italy, and in the context of the Great Recession, the housing recession of 2008, the debt crisis of the European Union, The economic uncertainties and fears of Europeans was then laid upon the bodies of those poor refugees who were fleeing for their lives. And the anger and frustration was scapegoated to those refugee populations. And this culminates with the Brexit vote in 2016. Donald Trump is elected in 2016, also sort of mixing this anger about neoliberal globalism with anger towards immigrants and Muslims, Muslim immigrants in particular, and refugees. And indeed, we had a manufactured crisis on the southern border, not in terms of an uptick of refugee flows from Central America, but the incarceration and separation of asylum seekers with a draconian refugee policy that hands down violates international law. And now we're in COVID, right? All these texts, all of these videos that we have been watching are prior to this moment of this pandemic. And I'm fearful for what this means for the future of global relations. But maybe we can talk a little bit more about that on Monday when we think about where do we go from here. And also worth mentioning is that, thinking about Islamophobia in Europe, also the terrorist attacks that took place in Paris, in Manchester, in London, also contributed to this fear and this xenophobia, right? Where you have sort of economic fears and economic hardship occurring alongside transformations in society. This is not, Bremer says, the messenger that drives this movement, drives this movement. It is the fears, often, if not always, justified of ordinary people. Fears of lost jobs, surging waves of strangers, vanishing national identity, and incomprehensible public violence associated with terrorism. So it's not just neoliberalism, it's the product of neoliberal economic problems that combine with large-scale movements of refugees arriving to Western countries that is going to make people in Europe and the United States want to put up walls. Yeah, well, I was going to make another point there about that, but I think I'll come back to that in a minute. Okay. So just to sort of make sure that we're working with some clarified definitions here, the difference between globalism and globalization, remember, we're talking what Bremer and what President Trump and many people use in terms of the term globalism is not globalization, okay? We're working with a much more ample definition of globalization that is defined as the multiple trajectories of social spatial change unevenly taking place during intensified global integration. It can be transatlantic slave trade. It can be the history of the scramble for Africa in the Congo. It is a history of 30 to 60 million Europeans migrating to the United States between 1820 and 1920. Those are all chapters of globalization. Globalism is this chapter of neoliberal dominance and hegemony in which the global economy was restructured along neoliberal thinking and neoliberal policies. And all but a handful of people have suffered, right? There have been very few people who have won real big, but the vast majority of us have not won out. And don't you think for a minute that those refugee flows from Central America isn't related to those economic changes? But it's not just economic, right? The Syrian war, which is a fallout of the Arab Spring and the struggle for democratization in Syria, has now become a global proxy war between global powers vying for power in the Middle East, which is all about oil. And the 6 million refugees have received a lot of hate from the people that should be helping them out. Because gosh, if you're, us versus them. That's the situation that this nightmare has produced. The failures of neoliberal globalism have created inequality, and this inequality has created a world of divisions, a world of xenophobia. And us via them, us versus them, if you are a Trump supporter, might be we the people against the corrupt government of the United States. If you're a Bernie Sanders supporter and you find that class dynamics drive your understanding of the world, you're locked in a rich versus poor, us versus them. In many places in the United States, unfortunately, and along many societies in Europe, this us versus them has taken the shape of blaming immigrants for the country's problems, and particularly Muslim immigrants in particular. And now, most recently, and very painfully for a lot of us, the divisions between Republicans and Democrats. This is all a product of this complex combination of the difficult state of the world. And it's important that you understand how we got here, because if we understand how we got there, we can think of other alternatives. So Bremer states that neoliberal globalism contains the seeds of its own destruction. Even as it makes the world better, the percentage of people living on $1 a day has decreased, although the percentage of people living on $5 a day is still half of the world's population. You know, despite the fact that globalization has had, neoliberal globalism has brought some benefits, it breeds economic and cultural insecurity. And when people act out of fear, bad things happen. I remember what I was going to say now. One of the ways in which us versus them has played out, and the way in which these economic fears have become cultural fears and anxieties, many people argue that white working class men in particular, as they have lost economic status in the United States, at the same time they feel their cultural status as white men being challenged by feminist movements, by the call for civil rights and equality among African Americans and other non-white populations, and also the rise of gay rights and trans rights in this country makes the prestige and power of white working and middle class people feel threatened, right? 50 years ago, white working class people made a living wage, and they were on the top of the social ladder because of racism, sexism, homophobia. Now they have lost economic power at the same time that their cultural prestige, the idea that they are the right leaders of the family, that families should look this certain way, that women shouldn't do this or challenge men's authority and power, right? That all of these things combine to produce a backlash by these groups who are basically scapegoating minorities for the economic hardships that they are experiencing. So at the same time that neoliberalism has made goods from China come to the United States and be cheap, so we can have all of the stuff we want, right, for cheaper than we would have in the past, it's driven wages down. And as we saw in the video, it's not just free trade, but automation and telecommunications and advances in AI, artificial intelligence, that are reducing the availability of these sort of entry-level, low-skill, low-education jobs. For example, Bremer says that 88% of job loss in the US is due to automation, okay, in manufacturing. And there's concerns that, I was watching another video preparing for this lecture, and it was about the truck driving industry. And there's 3 million Americans who are truck drivers in this country, and we're on the cusp of automating transport. Actually, Uber bought up some technology from Silicon Valley a couple years ago that's being developed by Tesla and other companies, Google, to have driverless cars and eventually driverless transport and semi-driver. We won't have semi-drivers, right? So this is sort of another aspect of our economy that might be hollowed out. And it's not easy for someone to transition from being a truck driver to going and working in tech or into healthcare. It takes a lot of years to develop that education for healthcare and tech. So it's not just like you can retrain and get into a new field. Also, food. We see the automation of even in McDonald's where you can go, or even in the supermarket at H-E-B, those types of jobs are disappearing too. So these are all part of the dynamics that are driving inequality. So yes, when economic insecurity breeds cultural insecurity, people act out of fear and bad things happen. Economic fears generally breed a second type of fear. We see this in my political geography class. We talk about different moments in American history when the economy gets rough, anti-immigration attitudes flare up. Okay, so one type of insecurity breeds another. Globalization moves people, feeding public anxiety about shifting racial, ethnic, linguistic, and religious makeup of some communities. So in Britain, for example, after the Schengen arrangement was passed in the Schengen area, which allowed for the free mobility of people to work and live within the European Union, there was a doubling of residents born outside of the UK who are residing in England. So as people are experiencing insecurity in England about their declining wages, about the rising cost of education, all of a sudden they're seeing this other change, and it makes people feel out of touch. And it's easy for those people in that moment to blame foreigners rather than thinking about the macroeconomic policies that have produced the poverty that faces them. Talking about the migrant crisis in Europe, 2015, 2016, 3 million asylum seekers applying for asylum in the EU. This was part of the cultural upheaval, the social upheaval that clashed with this economic crisis to produce the conditions that allowed for nationalism to rise. And we also have to be thinking about the role of the internet and social media in fanning misinformation and fear. So I'm feeling a little bit down today. I've had a lot of stuff going on. And I think that like a lot of you were wondering, what's going to happen now with the future and with COVID? And, what is this going to mean for the future of migrants, of refugees, of the working class? And, I think it was yesterday, we had news that the Trump administration is planning to sign an executive order that will halt all immigration to the United States. I mean, it's just like, wow, what's going on? We'll wait and see. So while this lecture has given us a hard look at what factors besides growing economic inequality, what's driven growing inequality in the United States and in Europe, what other cultural dynamics, social dynamics, the migrant crisis in particular in Europe, combined to produce this nationalist far-right resurgence of populism. What does the future hold? We're going to be reading a text by the Nobel economist Joseph Stiglitz, who's going to give us some suggestions about how we might change the rules of the game of globalization to make this the most fair world for the most people possible, right? Both in terms of what types of economic arrangements we need to put into place to deal with this problem of economic inequality. And if you don't think that it's a problem, I will take you to the southern border and we'll take you to those refugee camps, and I will make you look in the face those people who are fleeing the violence that our country helped produce, both through the consumption of drugs, the war on drugs policy in Central America, and of course, the US's role in usurping democratic processes in places like Guatemala that would have made a very big difference in the outcome of that country today. We had our hand, the US did, in producing that refugee flow, and now children are being separated from their families and incarcerated. That's a legacy that we are going to be living with for a long time, and it's not going to be a good one. So if I would encourage you next fall, if you don't think that that's a problem, you can come with me to those camps and actually meet some of those people. And then you'll actually have some knowledge to base your arguments on. So let's think about what we need to do, what we could do to get ourselves out of this situation. And I want to remind you that we're going to have a quiz on Monday, as I told you at the beginning of this lecture. So be sure to do the reading. It's the last reading of the semester. Yay! Because next Wednesday, I'm just giving you a reading day to catch up on past lectures and to think about the review that we'll have a week from today, getting ready for the final. And exam 3, it's really exam 3 rather than a comprehensive final. So we have a little bit of a pause next week to let you get caught up and start thinking about the course as a whole and drawing things together. Okay, I have office hours tomorrow from 1 to 2 p.m. So you can find me here on my Zoom site then. I am wishing you all the best, and I hope to see some of you tomorrow on office hours. All right, take care of yourselves. Please let Sarah and I know if there's anything that we can do to help you finish this course successfully. We're really here to support you, and we're really trying to put the message here that we're all in it together, okay? Rather than an us versus them. We are in this together. We're here to support you. Wishing you all well. See you next week.